I got to the office at 7:43 that morning, the same time I always did. The same elevator, the same badge tap, the same coffee from the machine on the 4th floor because the good espresso bar on the 2nd didn't open until 8, and I never waited. I set my bag down on my desk, opened my laptop, pulled up the calendar. Her first meeting was at 9, then a board call at 11, then a lunch that would run long because it always did. Then me, hovering just outside whatever room she was in, ready with whatever she needed before she finished needing it. 5 years of this. 5 years of knowing her schedule better than she did, of answering emails in her name, of standing in glass-walled conference rooms while she spoke to investors in that voice she used, measured, precise, with no room in it for anything accidental. I poured my coffee. I sat down. I opened the document she'd asked me to revise before 8. And then I noticed it. Her coat was still on the rack by the door. She never left her coat on the rack. She always hung it herself in the small closet behind her desk, because she'd told me once, exactly once, that she didn't like things out of place where everyone could see them. I looked at the coat for too long, and I didn't understand why my chest did what it did when I looked at it. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that 5 years of running someone else's life down to the last detail could make a person read meaning into the way a coat hung on a rack. I almost believed it. Her name was Diana Voss. That was how she introduced herself the day I interviewed for the position. Not Ms. Voss, not Diana, just the full name, said the way someone says a building's address. Factual. Placed. Non-negotiable. She was the CEO of a mid-sized investment consulting firm in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the air always smelled like printer toner and ambition, where every piece of furniture had been chosen to communicate control. She'd built the company herself, starting in her late 20s with 2 junior analysts and a client list that fit on one page. By the time I sat across from her in that first interview, the company had 46 employees, 3 offices, and a reputation for being the kind of firm that delivered results and didn't explain itself. She was 38. I was 29. She looked at my resume for exactly 40 seconds before setting it face down on her desk and asking me what I thought the most underrated skill in executive support was. I said anticipation. She looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said, "You start Monday." That was it. No warm-up, no pleasantries, no "we'll be in touch." Just a decision, already made. I should have known then what I was walking into. For the first 2 years I told people the job was intense, which was true but incomplete. The way saying a storm is wet is technically accurate, but misses the whole experience. Diana was not a difficult person to work for in the ways I'd been warned about. She wasn't volatile. She didn't throw things or scream. She was simply exacting. She noticed everything. She expected the same. If a meeting room was set up with the chairs at the wrong angle, she would adjust them herself, without saying a word, and the silence of that adjustment communicated more clearly than any reprimand. She didn't ask for much, personally. That was the thing. She was the most self-sufficient person I had ever worked for. She didn't need me to remind her to eat, or to call her mother, or to pick up her dry cleaning. She needed me to manage the infrastructure of her professional life, so that she could focus entirely on the part of the work that only she could do. And she was very clear about where that line was. The line was everywhere. Outside of work, she didn't exist to me. I didn't know where she lived, not precisely. I knew she had an apartment somewhere in Lincoln Park, because she once mentioned it in a sentence about commute times, but I didn't know the street or the building or what her windows looked at. I didn't know if she had friends, close ones, the kind you call on a hard Tuesday night. I didn't know what she ate when no one was watching, or what she did on Sundays, or whether she ever let herself just be somewhere without performing composure. I knew her professionally, completely, and in every other way, not at all. I told myself that was how it was supposed to be. For years I believed that. It started slowly. The the way things that change you always do. Not with a crash, but with a series of moments so small that by the time you notice them, you've already been changed. The first moment I can name happened on a Thursday in November. We were in the car on the way back from a client dinner that had run almost 2 hours longer than it should have. Diana was in the back seat, and I was going over the next morning's schedule on my tablet, reading out the appointments, and she said, "You can stop." I stopped. She was looking out the window at the city. The way the streetlights were moving across her face made her look different than she did in the office. Not softer exactly. More tired. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with the hour. She said without looking at me, "Do you ever get tired of it? Knowing everyone else's schedule but your own?" I didn't know how to answer that. The question was too direct for our dynamic, and I felt something shift in the car. Some small rearrangement of the air between us. I said, "I don't really think about it like that." She looked at me then, just for a second, and she said, "No, I don't suppose you would." Then she looked back out the window, and we didn't speak again until we reached her building. I thought about that exchange more than I should have. I catalogued it the way I catalogued everything else about her. Filed it, examined it, set it aside. Told myself she'd been tired. Told myself it was nothing. But something had moved. Somewhere in the structure of the thing I'd built in my head, the professional architecture of who she was to me and who I was to her, something had shifted a 1/4 inch, and I couldn't shift it back. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. The way she put her pen down when she was genuinely thinking about something, setting it parallel to the edge of the desk, like it mattered. The way she said my name, Claire, at the beginning of a sentence when she was about to tell me something she considered important. Not as a summoning. More like the name was a door she was choosing to knock on. The way she sometimes paused, just a half second, before answering questions from investors or board members, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding how much of the answer to give. I noticed all of this. And then I told myself I noticed it because I was good at my job, because I was. That was the story I had. 5 years in, and the story still fit. I was excellent at my job. I understood her better than anyone. That was professional, not personal. That was skill, not feeling. I told myself that through the 3rd year, and most of the 4th. And then came the afternoon in February when she left her coat on the rack again. Not the first time, but the second. And I walked past it 3 times in 1 hour before I admitted to myself that I had been walking past it on purpose. Not to hang it up. Just to see it. I went home that night and couldn't explain why the apartment felt so quiet. I made dinner I didn't eat. I called my sister and talked about nothing. I went to bed at 10 and lay there in the dark thinking about a coat on a rack and a voice that said my name like a door. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I almost made it to sleep believing that. The problem with working that closely with someone is that you learn the sounds of them, not just the voice, the whole register, the weight of their footsteps in the morning versus the afternoon, the particular silence that follows a call that went badly, the way the light in their office changes when they've been reading for too long and haven't gotten up. You learn all of it without meaning to. And then one day you realize you've been carrying a map of someone in your body, and you don't know when you drew it. I knew when Diana was stressed before she said anything. I knew when she was sharp tired. The kind of sharp that came from managing too many things at once, versus quiet tired. The kind that came from something deeper. I knew that she drank her coffee without sugar except on days when something had gone wrong before 9 a.m. I knew that she always reviewed her own presentation slides twice, always, even when she'd seen them 100 times, because control was the way she managed the fear of being caught off guard. I knew all of this, and I had always been able to hold it at a distance. Professionally useful knowledge. Nothing more. What I could not hold at a distance was what happened at the Meridian Conference. We were in Seattle for 3 days. The firm was presenting at an industry summit, Diana headlining the second afternoon, and I was there to manage logistics. The hotel rooms, the dinner reservations, the backup slides, the schedule that shifted 4 times in 24 hours, because these things always did. On the second night, after the networking dinner wound down and the last client had finally said goodbye, Diana and I ended up in the hotel lobby. The bar was still open. There was no reason for either of us to linger. She had a 7 a.m. call, and I had to be at the registration desk by 8. She looked at the bar. She looked at me. She said, "I don't want to go upstairs yet." I didn't say anything. I just sat down. She ordered a glass of red wine, something the bartender recommended, and I ordered the same because I wasn't thinking clearly. She was out of her work clothes for the first time in 3 days. She'd changed after the presentation, and she was wearing something dark and simple, and I made myself look at the bar. We talked. And that was the word for it, talked. But it wasn't the conversation we usually had. There was no agenda, no objectives, no one taking notes or managing outcomes. She talked about the city a little, about how she always found conference hotels disorienting, how they were designed to make every city feel like the same city. She said she'd studied in Seattle for a semester in college, a long time ago, and she'd loved the light here, the particular gray of it, the way it made everything feel slightly more serious than it actually was. I said I'd never been here before. She said, "What do you think of it?" And I said, "I think I'd like to see more of it, not the conference version, the real one." She looked at me when I said that, a long look. And then she smiled, not the one she used in meetings that measured professional quarter smile. Something else. Something I hadn't seen before. A smile that was smaller and more private, and that she seemed to let happen by accident. She said, "Me too." Nothing happened. We finished our drinks. She went upstairs. I went upstairs. But I lay in my hotel room that night with the gray Seattle light coming through the curtains, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Something that had nothing to do with schedules or outcomes or the professional management of someone else's life. Something that was purely mine. Something that was purely about her. I named it the next morning, alone in the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror while the shower ran. And then I spent the entire flight back to Chicago trying to put it back wherever it had come from. I couldn't. So I did the next best thing. I became more efficient, more precise, more indispensable. I put all of it into the work, into being so good at the job that there was no room left for anything else. I answered her emails faster. I anticipated further in advance. I made myself necessary in a way that was almost compulsive, because if I was necessary, then the thing I felt had a container. It had a shape I could name without terror. She noticed. One afternoon in April, she called me into her office for no visible reason and said, "You seem different lately." I said, "Different how?" She said, "More pressed, like you're carrying something heavy and you've decided the solution is to walk faster." I looked at her. I kept my face very still. I said, "I'm fine." She held my gaze for a second too long. Then she said, "Okay, Claire." That was all. She turned back to her computer. I walked back to my desk and sat down and breathed for a moment before opening anything. She knew. Not everything, but something. She was too precise not to notice, and I had been too careless, too raw, to hide it as well as I thought I had. And the worst part, the part I couldn't say to anyone, not to my sister, not to my friend Margot, who would have had a lot to say about it, was this. She'd noticed me. She'd looked at me and seen something real. And even though what she saw had the potential to collapse 5 years of carefully constructed professional distance, some part of me, the part I could not discipline into silence, was glad. But before we go any further, if you're still here, You already know what this feeling is. That specific weight of carrying something you can't say in the place where you spend most of your waking hours. Hit the like button right now. It costs you nothing and it helps this channel more than you know. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe and turn on the bell. So YouTube notifies you every time a new story drops here. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever had to pretend you felt nothing every single day for someone you worked with? What did that cost you? Type it out. I read every single one. And tell me what city you're watching from. I heart every answer. Now, back to Claire, because things are about to shift in a way neither of them saw coming. It was a Tuesday in June when everything broke. Not dramatically. Not with a confrontation, or a declaration, or anything you could point to and say, there. That was the moment. It was a Tuesday in June, and I walked into the office at 7:43, and Diana's door was already closed. And when I knocked, she said, "Come in," and I went in, and she was standing at the window with her back to me. She didn't turn around. She said, "Close the door." I did. She said, "I need to tell you something." And that was when I felt it. The particular quality of that sentence, the way it landed in the room. Not bureaucratic, not professional, something else entirely. I said, "Okay." She turned around. And I had worked beside this woman for 5 years. I had watched her handle collapsing markets and difficult board members and crises that would have broken most people. And I had never, not once, seen her look the way she looked at that moment. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was afraid of it. She said, "I've been thinking about something for a long time, and I've been telling myself that the right thing to do was not to say it. Because you work for me. Because I value what we've built here. Because saying it out loud changes everything, and I don't know that I have the right to ask you to live in a changed version of things." I waited. She said, "I've been telling myself it's professional. What I feel. I've been telling myself that caring about someone's well-being, being interested in them, wanting to know what they think about the light in Seattle, I've been telling myself all of that is normal and managerial and not what it actually is." I couldn't breathe correctly. She said, "I'm not good at this. I need you to know that I know that. I have spent the better part of my adult life making myself very good at being self-sufficient and very good at keeping everything in its right place, and what I haven't been good at is this. Saying what I mean when it matters. Saying it to someone who matters." She looked at me. "You are the only person I know," she said, "who has ever made me feel like I didn't need to manage myself around them. You're the only one who sees, I don't know how to explain this, you're the only one who sees the work, and also sees the person doing it. And I know that's your job. I know that's what I pay you to do. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like..." She stopped. I said, "Diana." She said, Don't let me off the hook. I need to say it." I didn't say anything. She said quietly, almost to herself, "You're the only real thing in my life, Claire, and I don't know when that happened. I only know I can't pretend I haven't noticed." The room was absolutely still. I stood there and felt 5 years reorganize themselves inside me. Every professional boundary I'd ever drawn. Every time I'd looked at her coat on the rack and looked away. Every long flight home from a conference where I'd told myself it was nothing and almost believed it. All of it. Reordering itself into a shape I hadn't let myself see before. And here was the thing I hadn't expected. Here was the inversion I hadn't been prepared for. I had spent 5 years believing that she was the certain one, the unshakable one, the woman who always knew exactly what she needed and never second-guessed the knowing. I had built my entire understanding of the dynamic between us on that assumption, that she was steady, and I was the one quietly untethered by something I couldn't name. I had been wrong. She had been afraid the whole time, longer than me, maybe. She had been standing behind that glass wall of composure and professionalism and managing everything perfectly, and she had been terrified. Not of the work, of this, of wanting something she didn't know how to ask for. Of being seen, really seen, and not knowing whether the seeing would be welcomed or would cost her the one thing in her life that had ever felt genuinely real. She was the one who'd been waiting. She was the one who had not said anything for years. She was the one who had learned to make herself sufficient so well that she'd almost convinced herself she was. And in the end, she was the one standing at a window, talking to the glass before she turned around, confessing something that must have taken everything she had. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, walking into that interview with a resume she'd held for 40 seconds before turning face down. I thought about the woman I'd been building myself into since then, capable, precise, always half a step ahead. And I thought about how much of that had been real growth and how much of it had been a story I told myself so I didn't have to tell the truth. I had been hiding too, just differently. And maybe that was the thing neither of us had seen coming. That we had both spent years being brave about everything except this. That we had both mistaken the management of ourselves for strength. That the most unguarded either of us had ever been was in the spaces between the professional things. A hotel lobby in Seattle, a car on a rainy Thursday night, a coat left on a rack for someone who looked at it too long. I crossed the room. I didn't say anything yet. I stood close enough that she could see my face clearly, and I waited until she looked at me. Really looked at me. Not with the measured CEO look, but with the one I'd only glimpsed twice before. The one that was unscheduled, unmanaged. The one that had been there the whole time underneath everything else. Then I said, "How long?" She said, "Longer than I want to admit." I said, "Me too." The light in her office was different that morning. Or maybe I was different. Maybe I was finally looking at it without trying to correct for what I felt. 3 things happened after that morning, and none of them were what I would have predicted. The first, she cried. Not in the office. Later, on the phone, after I'd gone home early because we'd both agreed we needed time before we could be in the same space professionally and pretend any of the normal things were still just normal. She called me that evening and her voice was different, lower, slower, and she told me she hadn't cried in years. That she had trained herself out of it so thoroughly, she'd been genuinely surprised when it happened. I said, "What does it feel like?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Like relief," which is not what I expected. The second thing, I stopped being indispensable. Not immediately, not completely. But in the weeks that followed, as we navigated what we were and what the work would look like, and what we owed each other in terms of honesty, and also in terms of the practical reality of a professional relationship that had become something more. In those weeks, I started to understand something I hadn't been willing to see. I had made myself necessary because I was afraid of what happened if I wasn't. I had wrapped my value up so tightly in her schedule, her outcomes, her professional life, that I had almost forgotten I existed outside of it. She had needed me to function, and I had needed to be needed, and we had both been getting something from the arrangement that had nothing to do with the line items on my job description, and now the arrangement was different, and I had to figure out who I was in it without using the job as the answer. That was harder than anything I'd expected. Harder than the confession, harder than the weeks of uncertainty about what would happen to the job, harder than the conversation with my sister that went long and required 2 phone calls to finish. I had to learn to take up space that wasn't defined by usefulness, to be present without a function, to let her see me when I wasn't managing anything, including myself. It turned out that was what she had wanted the whole time, not the professional version. Not the anticipation, the efficiency, the always being 1 step ahead. She had wanted the person underneath all of that, the one I'd been keeping busy so I didn't have to feel how much I wanted to be seen. The third thing, and this one took the longest to understand. She asked me, one evening in August, what I had thought about her. What I had really thought in those years before either of us said anything. whether I had ever believed she was actually cold. I thought about it carefully. I said, "No. I think I always knew there was something underneath it. I just didn't let myself look." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because if I looked and I saw it, I couldn't pretend I didn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I built all of it. The distance, the precision, the self-sufficiency. Because I was afraid that if anyone saw the actual version of me, they'd leave." That's what I learned early. Show too much and you lose the room. So I stopped showing. And then I forgot that showing was even an option. She looked at me. "You never left the room," she said. "In 5 years, you never left." I hadn't known that was what I'd been doing. But it was. I had been staying. Quietly, persistently, in every small way. The coffee at the right time, the schedule managed down to the last minute, the presence that never demanded anything in return. I had been saying, without any words, "I'm here." And she had been hearing it, and neither of us had known what it meant until neither of us could pretend anymore. She had been the one who looked certain. I had been the one who looked like I might break, but she was the one who'd been waiting to be found. And I was the one who had been there the whole time, staying, without understanding that that was its own kind of declaration. We were not who we had seemed to each other, or maybe we were, exactly, just finally from the right angle. I still got to the office at 7:43. Some things didn't change, and honestly, I didn't want them to. I still knew her schedule better than she did. I still made sure the conference rooms were right. I still brought her coffee when something had gone wrong before 9 a.m., because that was mine to notice, and I liked noticing it. But when she said my name now, Claire, at the beginning of a sentence, that old knock on the door, I didn't catalog it. I didn't file it away and make myself useful with the knowing. I just looked up. That was new. That small thing. Just looking up, meeting her eyes, not managing the moment into something I could hold at a professional distance. She smiled at me one morning across the office when she thought I wasn't watching. The small one. The one that happened by accident. I didn't look away. I had spent 5 years believing she was the certain one, and I was the one quietly unraveling. Turns out we were both holding on to something we didn't know how to name. Turns out the one who looked unbreakable was the one most afraid of being seen. Turns out the one who looked like she was just doing her job had been staying all along, because something in her already knew. The coat is still on the rack sometimes. I still notice. Now I know why. If this story found you somewhere you recognize, write "found" in the comments. Let me know you made it to the end. And if you want another story that gets into that place in you that most people don't see, it's already waiting on your screen. Take care of yourself. And until next time.